Okay, good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the CSA Revolution webinar series. We're actually at season 4, episode 2, believe it or not. My name is Stephen Cook. I'm the Vice President of Validation and Compliance with the Compliance Group. And a couple items before we start. We are recording this webinar, and we will share the recording with you within the next 48 hours. And then please send your questions to the chat box, and we'll take the questions at the end. I'd like to introduce Hillary Driscoll, Senior Director, IT Compliance and Validation at CGEN, and Barbara Voss, Senior Project Manager at CGEN. And we want to talk today about embracing CSA resistance. A lot of organizations are moving towards CSA or have moved towards CSA. But how do you make it a success story? How do you make it sustainable? How do you keep reinforcing the messages? And that's why we've asked CGEN to join us today, is they've done an amazing job and continue to do an amazing job within their organization. And with that, we'll kick it off.
Thanks, Stephen. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Just a brief overview of CGEN in case anybody's not familiar with us. We actually celebrate 25 years this year as a biotech company. We are focused in oncology medicines. We are located throughout North America and Europe. We have, I think it's actually higher than 2,800 now. I think it's 3,200 roughly employees. We have 4 marketed cancer therapies and focusing on the ADC and SEA technologies. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of an overview of the journey that we took to implement CSA concepts as part of our validation program. So I think that, we start down in the bottom left of the path, engaging our stakeholders. We established cross-functional teams. It was very important to work very closely with not only our IT organization, but our quality partners and the business representatives throughout the organization. So we started by engaging them, gaining support for what we were trying to do. We needed to assess what we had and figure out what recommendations we needed to make for our future state. We then worked to align our processes and our approach to validation with those recommendations. This involved updating our risk assessment approach to include the CSA concepts. We'll talk about that more a little bit on the next slides. We had to train the stakeholders, so those people that were impacted by the validation processes and needed to understand the changes. We worked very hard on communicating with them throughout the journey and continue to do so in aiding with their adoption of the updated processes. We did then actually have to update the framework. So all of the procedures, the work instructions, the job aids, we did create several new processes to expand our framework, and then updated several processes as well to apply those recommendations to implement those CSA concepts. And then we did deploy. So we actually had an effective date of the processes, a cutover date that we worked then to monitor the changes in implementation, if you will, in use through measurement and analysis. And now we're in a continuous improvement phase. So we are continuing to listen to members in the organization, hear the feedback and the questions that they're raising, share lessons learned and best practices that we're observing as we talk to members in the organization, monitor metrics and check for the effectiveness of the processes that we implemented. It was a long journey. We want to make sure that the changes that we worked hard as an organization to implement are actually doing for us what we want them to do for us. So that's just our journey at a glance. And we can talk about some more details on the next slide. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure going into this transformation, if you will, is that we were following a methodology for managing the change. So we leaned into Dr. John Cotter's 8 steps to leading change that you see represented in the visual. So again, just at a very high level, making sure that we were setting the stage, engaging our stakeholders appropriately, helping build understanding for why we're doing this, figuring out what we needed to do, what is our vision, what were those recommendations, and then communicating all of that, working together, working through the actions, making sure that we're keeping the organization updated with progress, with setbacks, with short-term milestones that we were hitting, and working on our plan for adoption and sustainability. So then ultimately moving into that institution of change and working to make it stick. And although it's represented in the visual as a relatively small picture or piece of the pie, rather, this making it stick, I think arguably that is the most important piece of the puzzle here, and what we'll focus on as we get through the presentation today. Next slide, please. So just to kind of summarize, we talked a little bit about this on the earlier slide with our journey overview, but in terms of the specifics of what we did to align our validation framework with the CSA principles, again, we did have to update our validation procedures to align with those concepts. So looking at how we were assessing risk with our requirements. So we did update our requirement risk assessment approach. We moved from an FMEA, that traditional risk assessment approach, to the CSA concept, where we are focusing on the potential of the requirement to impact patient health and safety and product quality. So it's just a similar concept, but a different way of looking at the risk. We introduced both the unscripted, we introduced the unscripted test approach in addition to then the traditional scripted test approach. So ensuring that we're really focusing the scripted testing on those higher areas of risk, on those areas that are most likely to or could potentially impact patient health and safety, have that higher risk, and then leaning into the unscripted testing for those areas of moderate risk or low risk, and even leveraging our vendor documentation more thoroughly, assuming that the vendor, of course, has an adequate quality management system. We configured our test management tool to align with the CSA principles. And to be honest, that's a little bit of a phased approach too. We're having to phase that in. We've gone through a couple configuration changes there, but some updates were needed in our test management tool. Going back to that idea of leaning into the vendor documentation for some of the testing for low areas of risk, we did need to update our validation processes to allow for that. So if we have a qualified GXP vendor and we have requirements that pose low risk, updating the procedures to allow for leveraging that vendor documentation. We created educational videos and quick reference cards to help increase understanding of primarily the scripted and unscripted testing and the new requirement risk approach in the context of CSA principles. But we also looked at a broad range of topics as part of educational videos to help the organization get reinforcement of key concepts in the validation processes. We updated our templates to include instructions and examples in an effort to make them more consumable and increase consistency in execution or implementation of those templates. So things like validation plans, validation plans and reports, unscripted and scripted test case templates, system descriptions, things of that nature. We did take a two-phase approach to our journey. our project. So in the course of those 2 phases, we created or updated a little over 30 validation-related procedure documents that made up our framework. We implemented 21 educational videos. We included 8 training presentations and 1 executive presentation to keep our senior leadership updated.
So Hillary, a few questions for you on this particular slide. The first one would be, you've now been living roughly a year with the new risk model. How is your organization adopting, and what challenges, and Barb, chime in here too if you've seen this. How is the organization adopting to the CSA framework for assessing risk, and what challenges are they finding in it, as well as how is the unscripted testing going, which is often a challenge for many organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of adoption, I would say it's steady. We have to be smart about updating our existing risk assessment to the new approach, right? So, our systems had the FMEA, the traditional risk assessment approach in place. And so as we go through change control on a system, generally speaking, what we're finding the teams are doing is transitioning to the new approach for any new or updated requirements. Recognizing, of course, that that means that we're sticking with the scripted testing for anything that we're not reassessing, right? And so we could be losing an opportunity there to follow the unscripted approach. But that's been one challenge we're working through, is how to balance that. So we're taking it on a case-by-case basis, but again, generally speaking, we're finding the teams are just adopting the new approach for new or updated requirements. I don't know, Barbara, if you want to add anything that you've observed, feel free to interrupt me. I think that, we've talked through, that's part of what we're talking through as an organization with our stakeholders is, the other challenge, and to go to the second part of the question, how is the unscripted testing going? We offered through some of our office hour forums, we've offered up time for team members who have adopted the unscripted testing to come and share their experience, what's working, what's not working. And what we're finding is that that's helping folks that have not yet tried the unscripted testing. Maybe they just haven't had a change control or had that opportunity on the systems they're supporting yet. It's helping them to hear from other practitioners, this isn't really so scary, it's not really so different, and this is what's worked for them and not worked for them, so that when they get to that point, they've got a little bit more context and real life scenario that they can refer back to.
Yeah,
One more
kind of
going. I'm sorry, Barb, go ahead.
Sure. Going back to the original project, I think when the compliance group came in, and when you, Stephen, came in and taught how to do unscripted testing, that it started to open up that possibility, and then people had fun in the class you offered, and as they learned the concept more and worked with it, then when Hillary reinforces it with the office hours, it continues to build people's idea of it, also the ability to talk about it, and it just starts becoming more the norm rather than something different.
That's great. And actually, I'm going to table my question for the next slide.
Okay.
Okay.
So in terms of change management and sustaining our change, so this is really critical. I think one of the things that we wanted to make sure going into this transformation, this journey that we went on, is that I think the process updates and the training, the communication through the project were really just the tip of the iceberg, right? There's so much more beyond that to sustain the change and work with our organization members to make sure that this is doing for us what we needed it to do. But to start off, in the beginning, we needed to gain senior leadership support. So we did that through engaging senior leadership, providing overviews of what CSA is, what it's not, the changes intended with it, the similarities with, that conceptually this is not much different than what we knew before, right? It's just a little bit of a different mindset and way of approaching it. We conducted training throughout the process, communication and training throughout on what we were doing, what changes were coming. The educational videos we spoke to, wanted to make sure that there was information available on demand, at any time for folks to go back and reference. So for example, Barbara mentioned the unscripted testing. We had the workshops with you, Stephen, and the compliance group got the concepts introduced, but it could be months before a team went through a change and actually needed to leverage that information. And so we have that training available, but we wanted these short on-demand videos to help reinforce those key topics. So that was key for us. The office hour sessions, Barbara mentioned those. So we set these up in the very beginning, and we've continued these. So these are just drop-in sessions. People can come get their questions addressed. We're using those to help manage change, to receive feedback. We can hear from our peers, again, what is working, what's not working, where there are questions. And I think, hearing from our peers on the adoption of the process, I think has been really critical for us in terms of contributing to that culture change that comes with that mindset change. It's one thing for me to say it, or Stephen, for you to say it in a training. It's another thing when we hear our peers who have actually gone through the change say, oh, okay, this isn't so bad. I can do this, and this is what I found. This was my experience. I think that goes a really long way. We've continued our monthly newsletters. So as we're going through this, we started this off in the beginning, and we've continued this just to help remind folks of references available, address, frequently asked questions, keep the teams engaged in what we're doing, what we're learning, reinforce points that some topics come up multiple times, and that's expected, right? And so just reinforcing, information. We have a SharePoint site that we stood up for our journey, and so this offers a place for individuals to come and get access to training materials, contact information, the what's and the whys. We found that the effective stakeholder management is really, really key. So again, up front, one of the first steps that we took in our journey was engaging our stakeholders, cross-functional stakeholders. This is a change that impacted individuals in multiple areas of our organization. And so identifying those individuals and keeping them engaged in the communications, not only through the projects, the phases of the project, but post the change has been really, really critical for us to keep aligned and help people absorb all the change. Kind of plays into then that measurement and analysis. So as part of our project, we defined success metrics and what we're going to do to measure the effectiveness of the change. We put into place a continuous improvement management plan outlining what and when we're going to provide oversight for and measure and analyze. So for example, looking at how we're going to measure if the processes are being adhered to. Are we seeing trends and kappas and deviations and a decrease in those 4 key process areas, for example, because that can help indicate to us where things are working or where they're not, and we need to continuously improve. And then the last but not least, and one of the things that we did in the very beginning was through the help of compliance group, get support from FDA's Cisco Vicente and the members of the CSA FISCA team to help talk to us about what CSA is, what we can expect. This was really, really key for us to get that support from our leadership team. So that was a key upfront step that we took on our change management path. As I was speaking through these, I guess one thing I just want to reinforce, we did all these things throughout the phases of our project. But the green check marks are key. They represent things that we have been continuing to do to sustain the change. So going back to that change management methodology, right, there were a lot of steps that we took up front through the project to help manage the change that was coming with our updates to the validation program, the computer system validation program. But those things don't stop with the closure of the project. It's really critical that we continue this outreach, the communication, the support for the organization to keep the teams engaged and support that adoption.
I think Hillary, there was one thing when Cisco joined with the executive and senior management at CGen, and this is probably my favorite story with you guys, is the senior management and the executive management wanted Cisco to answer particularly one question: how do we know we're implementing CSA right? And I loved his response at the time, because he said, how do you know you did CSV right?
Yep.
What's your story? Tell your story, defend your story, right? And CGen was an early adopter. CGen had actually implemented CSA tenets and principles before the draft guidance was even released, recognizing that it was still within the regulatory framework. And I think this is a great slide. I have a few additional kind of questions on it. When you talk about, could you both talk a little bit about the educational videos and the experience that you've seen in CGen, kind of the topics that you went into on those, a little bit more about what they're about?
Sure. Yeah. So we did solicit input from organization members on what they would like to see. We have our read and acknowledge our SOPs. We have an overview training for our validation process. But for these little nuggets, what did they really want to see? And so we go into, validation 101. What is validation? Why are we doing it? How do we assess risk associated with our computer systems? How do we write an unscripted test case? How do we write a scripted test case? How do I support members on my team who are in a GXP impacting role as their manager? What does that mean for me as their manager? I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. 2021 we did. I think we did the functional risk assessment. We did an overview of the functional risk assessment using the CSA concepts.
What's an audit? What's an inspection?
Yes, how to be audit and inspection ready. The importance of maintaining. Yeah, the inventory. I mean, there are a number. How do I determine what deliverables I need as part of my change control based on the type of change and the type of system that I'm updating? So yeah, there were a variety of topics. It was based on input from the organization. We didn't want to just come up with a list in isolation. And so far, the feedback that we're getting has been really positive. I think it's just kind of the way our culture works now, right? I think we referred to them in our sessions together, Steve, like that TikTok culture, right? Like we like these little short videos that we can just go, somebody can read to us what we need to know, essentially, right? And I think the videos are great because they're visually interesting. It's a lot. It's not the death by PowerPoint. So yeah, I think that helps.
Well, and to underscore listening to the audience, that we started with ideas of what videos we wanted to do, and then as Stephen was writing them, or as his company produced them, then we would see, oh, we need to change it to this. So there were feedback loops going on with the audience themselves, because some of the topics you could have a video that's an hour long. So it's like, what would be pithy, what would get to the point of what people really needed to hear. So a big part was listening to the audience and then making them short and probably a third of them changed from what we thought people would want to see. And we noticed, like, once we started posting them on the SharePoint site, people were watching them before we had even emailed and advertised that they were there.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we're living in this culture, like Hillary said, where we don't go to Google anymore. We go to YouTube to look up how to do something, and we don't want the 30-minute video on it, right? Summarize it for me in 4 minutes because I'm busy. And that was the idea here, was give these practitioners that don't do this in their everyday job, right? Yes, sure, it's available for Hillary's CSV team, but what about the other stakeholders, the business owners, the system owners, that do data migration on a once a year basis, right? Got a complicated topic. And can you, you know, instead of giving me a 15-page procedure on how to do it, can you summarize what I need to know in a 5-minute video? And that was the intent here. The other thing I had to Hillary was, how did you make these videos accessible? Did you put them behind a training wall?
Oh, yes, that's a great question. Yes, so we did talk about that because we wanted them to be available on demand. We didn't require them. They are technically posed as, or framed rather, as supplemental training. But what we did is we put them in our LMS, a Cornerstone. So they're available through a keyword search, and then as part of our transformation site, the validation transformation SharePoint site that we noted on the slide, we have a reference to them. So we stood up a CSV or validation program training page. So, you know, these are your available references and tools to aid you in implementing the validation processes, and that includes, of course, those educational videos.
Great, thank you. All right. Barb, would you like to talk about sustaining the change?
Sure. I think every project is a change management project, that no matter what you're going to be building or doing, you're going from the current state to the future state. So as a project manager, I think it's really important to have change management involved and change managers on a project. So we did have that. And as you can see from the previous slide, there were a lot of points of change going on, from creating new documentation or new videos or new ways of doing things to revising what already is there. So we had a pretty robust change management plan and also metrics involved in baselining what the current state was. And then, as Hillary talked about, in operationalizing it, adding metrics and measuring the metrics as we facilitate the change. One of the core pieces I think that Hillary also talked about was that to be able to have the change happen, you need a strong foundation. So I think the project structure itself helped to create this strong foundation that then you can build on over time. And it also helps introduce the idea of a cultural change in a company. So we, on the previous slide, targeted all those different areas, but one of the things we wanted to be sure is to have enough stakeholder involvement. And so in that light, for the original project, we had multiple stakeholder reviews of the different documentation. And part of the function of that was to educate people about the changes and get their buy-in, then that they could anticipate the changes coming, so that when new documentation or new processes went live, they already had that in their heads and it wasn't intimidating or scary. And plus, they could also be advocates in the company. We did have frequent steering team meetings, but because we had different issues to work through with the steering team was comprised of leadership across the company. So that way, again, we're creating champions who can go out and also help facilitate the change. We added, you know, the CSA test steps. Hillary has talked about that, but in the PMO, our project management office, we also have templates for projects, and we added test steps in that. So again, it's infiltrating, if you will, the culture at CGen and the way we do projects that are CSA, CSV related. And then,
which is a great one, Barb, because one of the questions we've received was, are there any tools that you've implemented to make the process easier or more effective? And I think the update to your project management template speaks to that.
Yeah, and it's also I think a great piece that it took a while to do from a project management perspective, was to look at the roles and how the actual shift to this and to a more robust CSA processes, how it impacted each role in the company. So in our second phase of the project, really addressing what is it I need to do as a project manager? What does that system analyst need to do? Or the tester or whoever it is, that really grounds it then in, oh, I need to do this today and I don't need to worry about those things over there. So that also was, I think, a key step, Stephen, in grounding the process in the company itself. The principles of addressing the resistance, I mean, sometimes with big projects like this, it's just like, oh, not this again. People don't want to do this, but Hillary actively would hold those office hour meetings, or in steering team meetings, we'd actively discuss what we could do to answer questions or deal with the resistance. I think people too were curious, so to lean on the curiosity of, oh, this is changing, what does that really mean? And to really go for the curiosity side, and it sort of bypasses the resistance sometimes. Just as a project manager, driving toward a project schedule and managing the risks during the project was a basic baseline of what we did on the project. And then also, I think a really big key for this project was to have the project success metrics, and also how we would measure going forward what change. So in operationalizing it, Hillary had developed a lot of the metrics so that we could know this is working or not. The rest of the materials of the training, the educational sessions, and ongoing support, we covered somewhat in the previous slide, and I can let you look at that and see if there are any questions on that. So I think, just to underscore, you build the strong foundation, and then you take those pieces and continue them. Once the project ends and you've delivered the basic materials, then you're building on it with more training materials, educational videos, quick reference guides people can look at, and the role-based training guides as well. And we still have educational sessions, and then also the ongoing support Hillary talked about previously.
Yeah, and I guess just to underscore, Barbara and Stephen, like that project structure I felt was really, really critical for us. We actually started off not having that structure in place immediately, right? I know, Barbara, you came to us relatively quickly after we started, but initially we didn't. I think having that, like you said, that foundation, and as part of that foundation, having that vision of where we are now and where we're trying to get, and giving that visibility to members in the organization, I think has really helped us kind of keep keep that path and where we're trying to get to. It's helping with that understanding, and I found that to be really helpful as part of that project structure as well. So having Barbara in place to drive the schedule, manage those risks, like you were saying, Barbara, but also, what is that vision, making sure that that's clear and available to the stakeholders.
And I love that you've got the continuous quality improvement plan. There's metrics you're monitoring. You've continued with the office hours. You're pointing people to the educational videos. You're continuing with the newsletter, right? So you didn't implement and go effective with all these procedures and say, okay, we're done. We did our part, recognizing that change is difficult. It takes people a little while to adopt and get used to the new practices. It's really easy to roll back to your comfort zone of what you already know.
Yeah, I agree.
Right, so, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I agree. I agree. I think that the project closed, but now the work is really beginning. The adoption.
Yeah, wait a minute. No.
Sorry, Barbara.
All right, Barb, do you want to summarize kind of what we learned, and then we'll jump into some questions because there are some good questions coming in.
Okay, so for the best practices and lessons learned, I think the principles here are what makes a good project. So it just, from my perspective, it just happened to be CSA, but these are principles you can apply to any project. But the senior leadership support is really critical. So should we do this project right now? And if we are, we need the support of the senior leadership. I think Hillary showed strong leadership, and it was a clear decision maker. So we always knew who the D was, who the decider was, and it was Hillary. So when there were conflicts sometimes, or people had different views of what should be done, it was handed to Hillary in her lap, and then she made decisions. And having that strong kind of leadership gets projects like this done. There was also close collaboration between the quality and IT functional teams. So again, with the office hours or with just discussions we'd have, it was very cross-functional. So there had to be a lot of roles worked out or a lot of documentation worked out about the roles. So again, communicating, like the bottom bullet there, communicate, communicate, communicate. That was a huge theme in this project, so that everybody could move forward together in alignment. The ensure clarity on what is and what is not changing with CSA, because people at CGen were starting with a certain framework. So, oh, do we keep doing this or do we change over to that? And working that through with them, because going in, we didn't have all the answers. So we had to continuously communicate so we could work through and get the feedback on what the answers would be. We've talked about managing it as a project, having a change management plan, and the activities for change to be able to sustain the change. And as Hillary talked about earlier, don't rely on read and acknowledge, but actually communicate with people. And then address any kind of questions. I mean, often there are really great reasons for resistance. People might not be clear on what's going on, or they might need to be taught something, or they're not really resisting, they just have a million other things to do. So it's really important to keep, again, the communication and address the reasons for the lack of buy-in or maybe confusion sometimes on a project. And again, I think our theme here is to communicate.
All right, with that, let's jump over to some questions. Hillary, did your two-phase approach to implementing CSA include a revised methodology for creating requirements? From my understanding, CSA is a testing strategy, ad hoc, exploratory, error guessing, day in the life, etc., which on the onset does not call for a change to requirements. So did you change how you write requirements because of CSA?
We didn't specifically because of CSA. So with our GXP systems, we're still leveraging a pretty traditional URS, FRS approach. I know there are parts of our organization or systems that we're supporting within our organization that are looking to adopt more of an agile approach to software delivery. So I think that the potential is there, like to look at, for example, user story approaches and things, but we did not address that specifically as part of our CSA journey.
All right. Do you perform risk assessment at the requirements level? In a requirements record in a test management tool, for example, and then link the requirements to the appropriate level of the test record?
Yes, that's correct. So we have risk fields on a tab within our validated test management tool. They include the fields that align to then our procedures around how we assess risk using the CSA concept. So, and to answer the first part of the question, we do assess risk at the requirement level. So we look at the potential of the requirement to impact patient health and safety or product quality. And then we look at how we're implementing the requirement. Is the requirement being implemented off the shelf? Are we configuring the system to implement the requirement, or are we custom building this, coding to meet that requirement? And then where those two intersect gives us our risk rating at the requirement level. And then that does tie then to, we're able to trace that within our tool to the required level of testing.
And then you did have to make some updates to your test management tool to allow for that unscripted, but there were a number of workarounds you were able to do without significant configuration changes.
That's right. That's right. So we were able to, we're still working through some of that. Truthfully, we have another configuration change coming mid this year. We were able to make some immediate configuration changes to support the initial rollout of the change. You're adding some additional values or changing values and drop down boxes, for example, drop down fields. But you're right, Stephen, we did just implement some workarounds. So did some mapping, this field is, might be called this in the system and used historically in this way, but now we're going to start using it this way. So we did communicate that as part of our change implementation, included that detail in our role-based training guides that were made available as part of the initial implementation.
Here's a great question for both of you. Who was the most resistant? Was it QA or the business?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I feel I mean, there's definitely been some questions and feedback as we've gone through. I think we've been relatively lucky in that there hasn't been like complete resistance. I think especially like our quality partners were really heavily engaged with us, all the way through. I think, it was a partnership. I see it as a partnership. So I think, although there were, risks we had to work through and questions that came up, of course, throughout the phases and even now, we are working in very close partnership with them. So although I suppose there are scenarios where we could say it is resistance, it doesn't feel that way. It feels collaborative, and we're able to move forward together. I don't know, Barbara. Yeah, you said yes.
It's a tricky question. Yeah, so I think whenever you do large projects like this, that you're going to have impacts that you haven't predicted. So there's organizational changes that can happen and did happen because of this change. So it may not be directly like a document that you wrote created a change in the company, but the company has to realign around the new processes. So it's not resistance as much as I see different departments getting more clarity on what roles they play in this. So this became more important, but just more clear would be a better way to put it, than other departments in the business. Other departments in quality had to realign what they were doing, and then that in turn drives the role definitions. So it's not really, I don't think it's really resistance as much as people wanted clarity about what they needed to do, and departments wanted clarity about what they needed to do.
We're at time, but I have a few more minutes if you guys can stay, and if people want to stay on, we've still got some great questions. How long was your journey from concept to implementation, and what resources did you need to assign?
Great questions. So I started with CGen in the very end of February 2021, and the concepts were, there had been a transformation plan put together at that point. We took that transformation plan and really started building on it, the vision, how we were going to get there. So I'd say we really started in earnest in March of 2021. We implemented our first phase in April 2022. And then our second phase in October 2022. So I guess from start to finish, what is that, roughly 16 months?
Yeah.
And then of course, now we're sustaining the change. But for the 2 phases, that's how long it took. And I think it was roughly 32 documents that we updated through our quality our document control system, our EDMS, and all the training we mentioned. So that includes that full scope.
And while that number may seem overwhelming, remember that included things like templates, data migration plan
Yeah.
template, data report template. So that's not all procedures.
I agree. And the other thing just to underscore there too is it's not, we didn't update all of that in response to CSA. A lot of that we just updated in response to opportunities we saw to continue to mature and evolve our CSV or our computer system validation framework. So there were processes that we saw opportunities to augment or adjust in response to our organizational growth and change, not necessarily CSA. There were a handful of OPs and templates that we did update or create specifically in response to CSA, like the unscripted test case template, for example.
For resources, there was
Sorry, go ahead, Barb.
For resources, there was a project manager, and then of course Hillary, and then one of Hillary's managers, and then also change manager, and then of course the compliance group and their subject matter expertise. So we had actually a smaller project management team, but then we had a large extended stakeholder group where we would move like different assignments, if you will, or different tasks out to those stakeholders to deal with.
And there was a large review audience, and the review audience changed based on the subject matter.
Yep. Yeah, I thought that was really important too. We didn't want to author updated process and just put them out there and not have feedback from the people who are going to be consuming them, right? So it was really important to have representation from the various functional teams in IT, from quality, from our business system owners. So there was a large review team. And I think, as Barbara mentioned, I think you put it on you spoke to it on one of your slides, we did have multiple review cycles for those procedures too. So as we, as an initial draft was put out, then I know Stevens, you and your team would help us update it. We would review it again, and then a third time before it was considered final for review and approval.
And you will get off the wall crazy comments, right? I mean, expect them, but that's part of addressing people's anxiety over the process change, right? When they're encountering something unfamiliar.
Yeah, absolutely. I think through that review process, it was really important to me, at least, to try and I wanted to foster an environment for the reviewers where they didn't hold back. If it came to their mind when they were reviewing it, put it in the document, because the reality is that we actually got a lot of good content to help build out FAQs, to build training, kind of give us that proactive, okay, what could we anticipate when this actually gets put out to a much broader audience? What types of questions could we anticipate? So it gave us an opportunity to plan around that a little bit better, and actually put some of our adoption materials together as well. So questions would come up, scenarios like Barbara was saying, things we hadn't even considered. And we're like, oh, okay, that's a really good point. We need to make sure that's part of how we plan to adopt the change and how we communicate around this. So yeah, that was really, really key.
And we say, you've heard me say this a lot, CSA is not one size fits all, right? We don't have a vanilla set of procedures for you to implement. It's got to be adjusted for your organization. And so CSA CGEN through that review process really strengthened and implemented a CSA-based validation that worked for them, their risk tolerance, and their organization.
Yeah, I agree. Like one example that comes to mind is like our regulatory requirements, right? So our interpretation of the regulatory requirements for ensuring our GXP systems include audit trail and the right security controls and controls for electronic records. And so, our risk tolerance at this point was such that we decided not to apply the CSA risk approach to those requirements. We're just considering those high risk That may change over time, but for right now, so to your point, Stephen, yeah, we did, we discussed it. We talked about pros and cons, and we tailored it according to CGEN's risk tolerance and where we were as an organization.
I have a great question for both of you.
Okay.
Can you provide some examples of metrics that measured successful adoption during the project and for sustainability?
Yeah, so Barbara, maybe I'll let you speak to the project. I mean, one of the things that we've just recently looked at is so we did measure the effectiveness of our change through our change control processes. And so we did look at some executed examples of validation packages against the process expectations, and identified where the process was adhered to effectively, and where the guidance maybe wasn't followed as well, or where there was an opportunity to maybe reinforce something. So we looked at, the validation plans and reports, for example, and the number of sections, and we're able to roughly quantify, right, how well it was adopted. And so that was represented in an effectiveness check. So that was one thing we did, was looked at executed examples. We looked at document change requests, because one of the things that we were wanting to make sure we addressed through this transformation and the implementation of CSA was just a revisiting of roles and responsibilities, addressing ambiguities in that regard, as well as ambiguities in the processes, right? So we looked at, ensuring we had less than 10% of our document change requests in the controlled document tool for issues with roles and responsibilities and process ambiguities. So we had things like that. The other thing that was more of a perception measure, or it is a perception measure versus anything really quantitative, but it gave us some really good information, was in August 2021, we initiated a survey to get an understanding from stakeholders on how they viewed the processes. Did they understand what this was all about? So it gave us really a baseline, and then we resurveyed the organization in January of this year and measured the two to see if we saw an increase in the right direction of understanding the processes, understanding why we went through this. So we were looking for that trend, that upward trend, and we did. We were able to see that.
So with the project, we had the primary metric was, were people trained or not? So we had a target of, I think, about 99% of the people. We wanted, when the project finished, we wanted the people to be trained. So that metric of training went on through the sustainability then, because you're always getting new employees coming on board. So it's assuming all the rest of the materials are in place, then are people trained on it? Because then you can know at least that again, the basics are done, where they know that it exists and they're learning about it.
And I think, Barb, if you can just expand on the training a little bit. I know we touched on it earlier, but this wasn't just read and acknowledge or scroll and sign, as I refer to it, because that's the reality. Scroll and then sign, right? Get to the end of the document so you can sign it off. But we didn't just do read and acknowledge. If you can talk about some of the other training assets that were delivered to actually consider that a more robust metric.
Yeah, so part of it was the videos, which we've talked about quite a bit, and Hillary held office hours where she would train people on specific questions, but then also there were documents with the role-based acknowledgement, so people in certain departments would read about what their role was and what they would have to do. And then with the training in the initial project, the compliance group, you, Stephen, presented quite a few presentations summarizing what the changes would be or what it means. There were about 4 presentations, I believe, and then you also did the workshops where we learned about CSA and drew Easter eggs and talked about writing test scripts for Easter eggs. So that so it was really fun. I know that probably fun and CSA aren't always used in the same sentence, but we tried to make the training itself at least interesting and fun for the people learning.
Relatable, right? Relatable.
Yeah, that's a good word. Relatable.
We have a couple more questions. Let's try and get through. So Hillary, if a system's been around a while, then did you try to use CSA when changes were made? Did this cause a mess in your documentation?
You know, I've not heard that feedback yet. I mean, we've been taking sort of a phased approach to implement. So one of the things, so yeah, we have a big system, like a safety system, for example. So high risk, right? But not all the requirements are necessarily high risk. So we could apply the new process, the new risk assessment process, and potentially have some unscripted scenarios. But as we were talking about before, you know, we really have been taking that approach of just applying the new risk requirement risk assessment to any new or changed requirements. And so if we changed a requirement and we've had it previously as a traditional scripted test, and now we find that it's a moderate risk requirement, then we could modify our test script, and we have modified our test script to that unscripted approach, right? So, I mean, it hasn't caused a mess in the documentation. It causes for some documentation updates, but it hasn't caused a mess, if that helps.
All right, that's great. Do you have a CSV team that leads people through the validation process and templates, or are SMEs more on their own?
That's a great question. So it's the former for us. So we do have a CSV team. It's a team I lead at CGen. We're part of Global IT. We work very closely with our quality partners, but we are the first point of contact for the teams when there are questions or consultation needed on the validation process. We work with the teams to author the validation strategy, summarize the validation at the end, and guide them through the process. Not to say that other members of the team are, you know, absolved of needing to understand. You know, I think we've been trying to change the mindset in the organization that you know, quality and compliance is a team sport. We all have a role towards quality and compliance. You know, the PM, you know, Barbara might not be the expert in CSV or CSA, but Barbara still has a critical role as part of that project, as an example. Sorry to pick on you, Barbara. So anyway, that's the approach that we've been trying to reinforce. But the short answer is yes, there is a CSV contact that's working with the teams and guiding them.
Great. We had a lot of questions. I tried to get through as many as possible. We are at the hour. We can't take all the questions now, but we will reach out to you with answers as quickly as possible and get those replies to you. I want to thank Hillary and Barb for attending today. I feel like this was a really good session that wasn't just the traditional CSA, but in terms of how do you make it stick?
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and stay tuned for the next webinar in April.
Have a good day.
Okay, have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.